Hello BookTube. If you've been watching this channel, you'll know that I've been working my way through the Bone series by Jeff Smith. And as I get into some of the other books related to the Bone series, I discovered via Wikipedia that there is a book called Thorn, which collects the college strips that Jeff Smith did in 1982 to 1986. So it turns out that before Jeff Smith did the Bone series, he used many of these same characters and many of these same plot points when he was writing a newspaper strip for the college newspaper. I believe it was Ohio State, from 1982 to 1986. And according to Wikipedia, this has been out of print for several years, but thanks to a Kickstarter campaign, this collection was republished in 2024, and I got it out from my library through interlibrary loan. So this collects the strips published in fall of 1982 all the way here to 1986. Now, if you are interested in the history of the Bone series, these strips are really interesting. And I guess the thing that's most interesting about them is how much of the characters and plot points for the Bone series were worked out back in these strips in the early to mid 80s. I had previous to, I got the impression from reading Wikipedia that this was just where some of the characters first appeared, but it was in a different format and the stories were different, etc. And, you know, it is in a different format and the stories are a bit different. But if you're familiar with the Bone series, it's remarkable how many similarities there are. So many of the characters are the same. Thorn, Bone, the Dragon, Phony Bone, Smiley Bone, Grandma Ben, the rat creatures, Ted the Bug and his brother, the Hooded One, Briar, Rockjaw, the Mountain Lion, King Duck is in here. And the plot is a little less focused and a little bit more meandering and goes down various tangents. But the basic idea of this confrontation between Grandma Ben and her sister Briar is here. And Rockjaw, being someone who's on neither side, is also here. And the Dragon, I mean, it's so much of it is here. The Hooded One wanting to capture Phony Bone. The Phone Bone going on a journey to return a cub to its mother in the mountains. It's just so much of what would later go on to become the Bone series is already here. Now, it's a little bit rougher here, so this isn't as polished or as good as the original Bone series, but it's relatively readable in its own right, and it's especially interesting to just consider how much of the story was already being formed here. I had no idea prior to reading this that before the Bone comics, Jeff Smith had already experimented with this story once in rough draft form. So once I realized that, it completely changes my perspective of how I view the creation of the Bone comics. And, you know, I guess there's a couple lessons to draw from this. One is it's yet another reminder that great art or good stories seldom spring out of nowhere. So, you know, you read the Bone comics and you think, wow, this is really great storytelling. He's doing such a great job of balancing these different elements, of teasing out these things gradually, of foreshadowing, etc. And, you know, it is good, but part of the reason he's able to have such control of where the story is going is because this is a story he had already told, at least large parts of it, once before. So, you know, I think quite often as creators, if you've ever dabbled in writing stories like I have, and I think like a lot of us have, you get discouraged. You know, you get halfway into a story and you think, what's the use? This isn't nearly as good as the published material I read in the bookstores. And you forget that, you know, that published material doesn't come out of nowhere. It's an author who has probably been experimenting with this story and these characters for a long time. It's gone through several different drafts. It's maybe had an earlier incarnation, etc. And this is the early incarnation of the Bone series here. It also, you know, once you read through this, and as well as the introduction and the afterword and the interviews and stuff like that, which talked about how these strips were created, what was the influence on them, what was the creative process going on behind them, then I think you will have a much better idea of what makes the Bone series tick than some of these other supplemental Bone books that I've talked about on this channel. So I'm thinking about, you know, Bone Handbook or Bone Coda, a couple of books I've reviewed here on this channel, which are books about the Bone series, but which for my money give very little new insight into what makes these stories tick. But after seeing how the story evolved here first, you can really get under the hood of the evolution of the Bone series, so to speak. I mean, you can see already how the story is here in rough draft in the 1980s. Now, this, of course, raises the question of, well, where did this story come from? And I think that question is answered fairly well in the afterword here with Jeff Smith, when and let's see, where he talks about his influences, how he was using the Bone characters from a very young age, how in the late 70s he got into science fiction and heavy metal magazine, and then started to incorporate more epic fantasy elements into his drawings. And this is where the dragon and the rat creatures appear. And you can see where all these elements are gradually coming together. And then you can see the first rough draft of them in these comics. So, yeah, that's a broad overview of this collection. Now, I guess because these were daily strips, and because Jeff Smith was still working out the story, these go in a number of zigs and zags, the story does. So, for example, after we get done with the confrontation with the rat creatures, which plays out very similar to the way it does in the Bone comics, the Bone comics that Jeff Smith would later write, we get a little bit of a digression here, or maybe a lot of a digression, when Phony Bone hooks up with a con man who is meant to be a parody of Jerry Falwell and the, what was his group? The Moral Majority, using religion to scam people out of money. And there are a lot of different digressions like that, especially near the end, where the story goes off in a completely different direction. Jeff Smith says a couple times that he was not focused on the story at this time. He was trying to get the strip syndicated, so the story goes into a little bit of a dead end here at the end, but there's also more political satire. Ronnie Duty, the Talking Puppet, is meant to be a satire on Ronald Reagan. So, the Bone comic that would later emerge, I think, was relatively apolitical. But that's not true of Jeff Smith's earlier work. And, fair enough, he was a college student here. This is when people are usually very politically active or politically conscious. Conscious. Politically conscious. It's of uneven quality if you're just judging these strips on their own merit. And Jeff Smith admits as much a few times in the course of this book, once at the beginning and once at the end. But it's interesting to see the zigs and zags that the story takes at the same time. It's not boring to read this. You're always wondering where the story is going to go. It's interesting to see, I think. There is a lot of also interesting stuff at the end. There's an interview with Jeff Smith in which he talks about these strips. There is a controversy he got into, and those strips are not in the main part of the book, but they are here at the end. These are the unredacted strips that set up the controversy, and it was because there was a racist lady who had named her dog Kizzy, and it was meant to be a commentary on these types of racist people. Jeff Smith says in this interview here that it was based on a real person that he had met, but that was not appreciated by the student body, and it resulted in a big controversy, and he had to respond to that controversy in an editorial in the college newspaper. It's interesting. Reading this, you can see that the controversy was probably overblown. I think it's relatively obvious that Jeff Smith was trying to critique racism, not encourage racism, even though some people nonetheless found his images offensive. But it's a reminder that, maybe these things never change, right? We tend to think of like the new woke college campuses as something that only came about in the last 15 years or something. And before then, colleges were reasonable places of reasonable dialogue. But this illustrates how there was still this incredible amount of sensitivity and this censorship and cancellation culture was going on way back in colleges in the 1980s. So, yeah, interesting. So what else to say about this? There's plenty of little interesting side notes this strip goes through. And one of the things that also occurs not unfrequently is the fourth wall breaking. So the strips, the characters from the strip will come out to talk to Jeff Smith, the creator. He draws himself into the strip. And sometimes Jeff Smith will go in to the action. I think that happens earlier here. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, so Here we go. This is the battle with the rat creatures. It's anyone who's familiar with the Bone comic book will know this part of the storyline. Jeff Smith gets convinced by his characters that he has to go into the comic to help. So he writes himself into the battle with the rat creatures here. It's interesting. It's one of the things that's also talked about in here is that Jeff Smith's original plan for this was to get this comic strip syndicated in the national newspapers. He wanted to get picked up by a newspaper strip syndicalist, whatever it is. And that didn't work out because none of them were interested, or one of them was interested, but the one that was interested wanted him to make major changes that he didn't want to make. So this never got picked up as a comic strip. But it does kind of make you wonder, doesn't it, about an alternate universe in which this did become a comic strip. And we never got the Bone comics, but we got the same story playing out across the Bone comic strip. There's a part of me that is really curious to see what that comic strip would have evolved into, which, thinks it's kind of a pity that this didn't get picked up as a comic strip. Speaking of which, after the original comic ends, we get the comic being rebooted. So I guess in spring of 1985, after the original run had ended, Jeff Smith made another attempt at this comic, and he had an eye on selling it to newspaper syndicates, I don't know. He had an eye on selling it to newspapers. So it's the same Bone story again, with largely the same jokes recycled. And many of these jokes will later go on to be part of the Bone comic, the Bone comic book. But it's a little bit more polished this time. And Jeff Smith was actively trying to sell the comic to newspapers at this time. So even within this volume, we see a couple drafts. So we see like the first draft of the story, and then this one actually isn't the whole story again. But we see another attempt at a second draft of the story. So you can see how this story is evolving, and yeah, it's some of the stuff that would end up being kept for the later Bone comic, some of the stuff that would end up being cut for the later Bone comic. Yeah, it's interesting in that regard. Now, if you're not a big fan of the Bone comics, is this book for you? Well, probably not. If you haven't read the Bone comics, well, don't start with this one. Read the Bone comics first, and then if you're still hungry for more, then you can come back and check out Thorn, the early version of this story.